There is a clay tablet, baked in the kilns of ancient Mesopotamia, that most historians will not discuss in public lectures, not because it is fake, not because it is obscure, but because if you read it carefully, if you follow its logic all the way to the end, it stops sounding like mythology and starts sounding like a status report. It stops sounding like the past, and it starts sounding like a description of right now. The tablet belongs to a category of Sumerian texts known as the Me, pronounced May. And the Me were not prayers. They were not hymns. They were not creation stories in the traditional sense. The Me were a list, a precise, enumerated inventory of the powers that govern human civilization: kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, the arts of war, the arts of love, the scribal arts, judgment, and dozens more beyond those, 14 in some versions, over 100 in others. But across all versions, the message is the same. These powers were once accessible to humanity, and then, at a specific moment in recorded history, they were taken, concentrated, locked away. And the entity that took them had a name. That is what the tablet says. Not that the powers were lost, not that humanity forgot them, not that they were destroyed. Taken, removed with purpose, held in a location that the text describes in careful geographic and mythological detail. And the question that no one in mainstream academia wants to sit with for very long is simple. If the Sumerians were precise enough to invent writing, advanced mathematics, astronomical calendars, irrigation engineering, and the first codified legal systems, why would we assume the one thing they got catastrophically wrong was this? Why would a civilization capable of calculating the movements of Venus across 18 years of sky be incapable of accurately recording a political event? Stay with me, because this goes somewhere you are not expecting. The primary text we are dealing with is the Sumerian epic known as Inanna and Enki. It survives on multiple clay tablets, cross-referenced by Assyriologists across several museum collections, and it dates to at least 2000 BCE, though the oral tradition it encodes is believed to be centuries, possibly millennia, older than its first written form. In the epic, the goddess Inanna travels to the Abzu, the deep freshwater realm that lies beneath all things, to visit the god Enki, who holds the Me in his possession. She arrives with a purpose she does not announce. She sits down to drink with Enki. And as the night deepens and the beer flows and Enki's divine judgment loosens, he begins handing the Me to her, one by one, with increasing generosity. Over 100 sacred powers transferred across a table in the dark. Enki sobers up the next morning, looks around, realizes what he has done, panics, sends his messenger Isamud after Inanna with sea monsters and demons to intercept the boat of heaven before it can reach Uruk. He fails. Inanna outmaneuvers every wave of pursuit, and the Me arrive in Uruk, where Inanna stands at the gate of the city and presents them, one by one, to her people. On the surface, this reads like a divine heist story, a power transfer myth, something between a fairy tale and a political allegory, standard material for ancient religion. But Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsen spent decades arguing that Sumerian mythology was not symbolic fiction. It was historical memory encoded in divine language, because divine language was the only sufficiently permanent medium available. The gods were not metaphors. They were records of real events, real institutions, real transfers of power, described in the only idiom the culture had for speaking about things that exceeded ordinary human scale. And when you read the Me not as spiritual abstractions, but as concrete descriptions of social and cognitive technologies, something deeply uncomfortable emerges from the text, because the Me are not mystical. They are operational. The list preserved across multiple tablets includes kingship, the throne of kingship, the exalted and enduring crown, the royal insignia, the shepherd staff of kingship. It includes the descent into the underworld, and the ascent from the underworld, the control of the boundary between life and death, and whoever commands that boundary commands the most fundamental of all human fears. It includes the priestly offices. It includes the musical arts and the scribal arts, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the basket weaver. It includes sexual intercourse and prostitution, the standard, the quiver, lament, rejoicing, deceit, power, enmity, the destruction of cities, lamentation, joy of the heart, falsehood, art, the cult center, truth, and running through all of them, invisible but structuring everything, the principle of legitimate authority, the power to say this is how things are, and to have that declaration enforced. Read that list again, slowly. Because what you're looking at is not a spiritual wish list. It is not a religious fantasy. It is a taxonomy of civilizational control. Whoever holds the Me does not just influence civilization. They do not just participate in it. They define what civilization is permitted to become. They decide which human capacities are cultivated and which are suppressed. Or they determine what counts as order and what gets classified as chaos. The me are not tools. They are the operating system on which all other tools run. Now, here is where the tablet stops being ancient history. Among the me that scholars consider most significant, the ones that appear with greatest frequency across the widest range of traditions, are 7 specific powers. These 7 show up not just in Sumerian texts, but in Akkadian and Babylonian literature, in fragmented form in later Semitic religious traditions, and in structural echoes that researchers like Kramer and Jacobson have traced into early Indo-European cosmology. These 7 are not always labeled identically across traditions, but their functions are consistent. They govern the monopoly on legitimate violence, the authority to define and control information, the control of transition between life and death, the power over sexual and reproductive law, the technology of the written record and the archive, the administration and distribution of material resources, and the authority to define the sacred, to determine what is beyond question, what is untouchable, what can only be approached through authorized intermediaries. In modern language, military authority, information control, life and death jurisdiction, reproductive law, the archive, economic distribution, and the power to declare what is holy. Say those slowly and tell me you do not recognize the institutional landscape of the 21st century. Say those slowly and tell me you do not see the exact 7 domains where power is most fiercely guarded, most violently defended, and most deliberately kept inaccessible to ordinary people. The tablet's claim, stated plainly in the text, not as metaphor but as operational description, is that these 7 were removed from general human access, concentrated, held, and the removal was not accidental. It was argued for, justified, and institutionalized. The Inanna and Enki epic describes this concentration as temporary. The story's arc is a restoration. Inanna reclaiming for humanity what was wrongly monopolized. But here is the detail that most popular retellings omit, the detail that sits like a splinter in the narrative's comfortable resolution. When Inanna distributes the me in Uruk, the text does not say all of them reach the people. The boat of heaven docks. The me are unloaded at the quay. Inanna stands at the gate, and the script begins listing what is presented: the art of descent, musical instruments, the scribal arts, certain crafts. And then the narrative does something strange. It accelerates, it becomes general, it moves on. And in the transition, the careful reader notices that the 7 powers of governance, the 7 that define who holds authority over whom, are not distributed in any scene we have a surviving record of. They simply vanish from the story. Present in the inventory, Enki hands over. Absent from the distribution at the gate of Uruk, which is either a gap in the surviving tablets, and such gaps exist throughout the corpus, or it is the most consequential editorial decision in the history of human literature, a gap that means everything, a silence that is itself a message. Now we need to talk about a second document, because the Inanna and Enki epic does not stand alone in the textual record. There is a lesser-known Sumerian text, partially reconstructed from fragments distributed across collections at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the British Museum, that describes events after the Inanna epic closes. Scholars typically catalog it as a hymn to Inanna, a devotional piece of secondary importance. But its content is operational rather than devotional. It describes a council, the Anunnaki, the assembly of high gods whose deliberations in Sumerian cosmology constitute the closest thing to divine governance, convening after the distribution to formally assess what has been released into human hands and what, by consensus, has been withheld. The text is fragmentary in ways that are maddening, but the readable portions describe at least 3 of the 7 governance powers as having been deliberately retained, not by Enki acting alone in his cups, not by accident, but by formal council decision, with stated reasoning, with recorded justification. The justification, in the damaged but reconstructible Sumerian, translates across interpretive schools to something that is consistent in substance, even where it varies in phrasing. Humanity is not yet prepared to hold these without destruction of the ordered world. The Kior, the established cosmic and social order, would not survive autonomous human control of these 7 specific powers. And, therefore, the Council determined that stewardship must remain with designated holders until some future condition is met, a condition the text does not specify. A threshold the text does not define. That phrase, the ordered world, the Kior, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as the central value around which all divine action is organized. The Sumerians understood civilization as fundamentally fragile, constantly threatened by the forces of chaos that surrounded it on all sides: floods, invasions, internal disorder. The god's primary function, in Sumerian theology, was to maintain the Kior against these forces. And the argument encoded in the council text is sophisticated in a way that should not be dismissed as primitive thinking. Concentrated governance powers produce more stable civilization than distributed governance powers. The costs of that concentration, inequality, suppression, the subordination of individual human potential to systemic order, are real, acknowledged costs. But the council regards them as acceptable costs given the alternative, which is the chaos of uncoordinated human freedom exercising 7 forms of absolute power simultaneously. This is not a naive or ignorant political philosophy. This is an argument that has been made in different vocabularies by every defender of concentrated power, from the pharaohs to the present day. Order requires hierarchy. Hierarchy requires that someone hold the reins. The question the Sumerians were honest enough to ask explicitly in modern political theory tends to obscure, is not whether concentrated power produces order. It does. The question is whose order? Ordered for whom? Stable for whose benefit, but held by whom? That is the third layer. And it is the one that moves us from ancient history to something uncomfortably present. The Sumerian texts do not describe the Anunnaki as having taken the 7 powers into an eternal divine vault beyond human reach. They describe a system of custodianship administered through human institutions on Earth. The texts use the term EN holders, lord holders, power keepers, those entrusted with the management of specific me. And the EN holders are not described as divine. They are described as human offices, human lineages, human institutions that hold the powers in trust, which means the powers are present in the world. They are not hidden in heaven. They are administered right now by identifiable human structures that are the direct institutional descendants of the EN holders the Sumerians named. In Sumerian political theology, the structure is explicit. The king holds the me of legitimate violence, the power to organize armed force and declare its use lawful. The high priest holds the me of life-death jurisdiction, the power to mediate between the living and the dead, to determine the conditions of burial and inheritance, to adjudicate the disputes that arise at the most fundamental thresholds of human life. The Aduba, the tablet house, the scribal school, the archive institution, holds the me of the written record. The temple economic administrators hold the me of resource distribution. The institution of sacred sexuality holds the me of reproductive law. And the 2 remaining powers, information control and the definition of the sacred, are distributed between the royal court and the priestly hierarchy, creating the tension between secular and religious authority that has structured every complex civilization in human history. Now transpose that onto the present, not as metaphor, as structural analysis. The institutions that hold the monopoly on legitimate violence are defense establishments, police forces, the armed wings of states that define what violence is legal and what violence is criminal. The institutions that hold information control are the media infrastructure, the intelligence apparatus, the algorithmic systems that determine what information reaches whom and what is suppressed. Life-death jurisdiction is held by the combined medical-legal complex, the systems that define when life begins, when death is official, who has the right to make decisions about bodies, and what conditions govern the transition between them. Reproductive law is contested, but held in the gap between religious institutions and state legislation, with pharmaceutical and medical corporations increasingly claiming a share. The archive is held by the state, by corporations, by the intelligence community, the entities that hold the data, the records, the histories, the version of events that will be transmitted to future generations. Economic distribution is the domain of central banks, financial institutions, the monetary policy apparatus that determines who has access to resources and on what terms. And the definition of the sacred, the power to declare what cannot be questioned, is held by the intersection of media, academic institutions, legal structures, and the residual but still potent authority of religious bodies. The Sumerians did not invent the system, they documented it. They named its 7 components with precision. And they were honest, in a way that we rarely are, about the fundamental dynamic. These 7 powers do not distribute naturally. They concentrate. Not because of conspiracy, not because of malice, because concentration is more efficient than distribution for the purposes of maintaining civilizational stability. The EN holders hold the powers because holding them works, because diffusion produces conflict, because the Kiur, ordered civilization, requires that someone be in charge of each of these 7 domains. The tragedy is not that the powers are held. The tragedy is that the conversation about how they should be held, who should hold them, and on whose behalf, that conversation was shut down 4,000 years ago. And the silence has been maintained ever since. There is one final layer, and this is the layer that makes even sympathetic scholars uncomfortable. Across multiple Sumerian me texts, there is a recurring phrase that translators typically render as a ritual formula and pass over without extended comment. It appears in contexts describing the activation or transfer of me, and it translates, depending on the interpretive school, as either awakening the powers or awakening through the powers. In the Inanna epic, the phrase marks the moment she loads the me onto the boat of heaven. In the council text, it appears in the discussion of what the release of the withheld 7 would actually mean for human populations, and in a third text, a fragment associated with the city of Nippur and dating to the 3rd dynasty of Ur, It appears in what seems to be a description of communities that have somehow, temporarily, gained access to governance powers that were supposed to remain concentrated. The established scholarly interpretation is archetypal. This is language of spiritual initiation, cognitive transformation, the awakening of the individual to the divine order, standard comparative religion. But a second tradition of reading, associated with researchers working in cognitive archaeology and the anthropology of complex societies, interprets the phrase as operational rather than spiritual. What the Sumerians called awakening is a description of what actually happens to a population when it gains autonomous, unmediated access to the 7 governance powers, not metaphorically. Structurally, when communities hold their own monopoly on violence, they defend themselves instead of being controlled by those who hold force over them. The dynamic of protection becomes mutual rather than hierarchical. When communities hold their own information systems, they know what is actually happening in the world rather than knowing only what the information apparatus chooses to transmit. When communities hold their own life-death jurisdiction, they define their own values around the most fundamental transitions of human existence, rather than having those values defined by institutions with interests of their own. When communities hold their own reproductive law, their family and kinship structures reflect their actual needs rather than the needs of those who benefit from controlling population. When communities hold their own archives, their history cannot be rewritten by the winners of subsequent conflicts. When communities hold their own resource distribution, they cannot be starved into compliance. And when communities hold their own definition of the sacred, they cannot be told that their resistance to any of the above is a sin against the divine order. That is what the Sumerians called awakening. Not an individual spiritual experience, not enlightenment in the personal sense, a collective structural transformation in which a population stops being governed by the 7 powers and starts governing through them. And it is, according to the council text, precisely what the EN holders have spent 4,000 years ensuring does not happen. The clay tablet does not offer us a revolutionary program. It does not tell us how to take the powers back or whether taking them back is even the right frame. The Sumerian texts are honest, almost painfully honest, about the complexity. The ordered world is better than chaos. The cure has value. And the EN holders are not simply villains. They are institutions performing a function that Sumerian political theology regarded as genuinely necessary. The question the tablet asks, the question it has always asked across 4,000 years of silence, is not whether these powers should be held. The question is whether the holders still serve the function that justified the concentration in the first place, or whether the justification has decayed into pure self-perpetuation, whether the argument that humanity is not yet ready to hold these powers has any remaining content, or whether it was always, beneath the theological language, simply the powerful telling the powerless that power belongs to those who already have it. The tablet was baked in fire because unbaked clay dissolves in water. It was buried under the rubble of cities that fell to forces that did not want its contents read. It survived floods that erased other records, survived the deliberate burning of libraries that were themselves erected to control the archive. And it found its way, fragment by fragment, into storage rooms and university basements, where it waited in silence for a century for someone to read it, not as religious literature, not as mythology, not as the primitive cosmology of a superseded civilization, but as what it actually is, a status report, filed 4,000 years ago, describing a system that was already ancient when the first scribe pressed the first wedge into the first clay, still operational, still structured around the same 7 powers, still administered by the institutional descendants of the same EN holders, still justified by the same argument that has not been seriously re-examined since the Council of the Anunnaki closed its deliberations and the tablets were sealed. The 7 powers were taken from humanity. The people who hold them now are not gods. The Sumerians knew that. They said it explicitly. The EN holders are human. They are institutions. And institutions, unlike gods, are made by human decisions, which means they can be unmade or remade or fundamentally renegotiated by the same kind of human decisions. That is what the tablet says. That is what it has always said, through every dynasty that rose and fell above it, through every civilization that built itself on the same 7 pillars and called that building divinely ordained. The question is not what the tablet says. We know what it says. The question is what we are going to do with the information